I'm Hoa, 42 years old, a sales manager at a tech company in Hanoi. My life had always been stable, a steady job, a decent home, and I thought I had everything figured out. But that morning, when my husband, Tuan, walked into the living room holding divorce papers with a smile on his face like he'd won something, I felt the ground beneath me shatter. Tuan wasn't a bad person. I used to love him deeply, and we had what seemed like a perfect family life. But those words he spoke that morning, "I don't need you anymore." It felt like the earth had cracked open beneath my feet, and it wasn't just the divorce that knocked the wind out of me, it was what he said next. "My dad has $500 million, Hoa. I'm set for life. You were just the ATM until I got it." My stomach twisted in knots. I had seen glimpses of Tuan's selfishness before, little things like how he'd avoid doing chores or smile his way out of responsibility. But this was a whole new level of cold. He had married me, played the role of the caring husband, all while waiting for his father to die so he could cash in. The worst part, he was dragging his father's name through the mud. A man who had always treated me like his own daughter. I stood there, fists clenched, holding back the urge to scream. Tuan's father had just passed away a few days ago, and I was still grieving for the man who had been kind to me. Tuan's words felt like a betrayal of both of us. I wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly what I thought of his greedy, spineless plan, but something held me back. A quiet voice in my head, maybe his father's voice, said, "Stay calm, Hoa." So I took a deep breath, grabbed the divorce papers from his hand, and signed them right there. "Fine," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "File them yourself. Send my things when you're done." I walked out of that big house in Hanoi, past the manicured lawn and the life I thought we had built, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. Tuan thought he had won, but he was about to learn the hard way that the $500 million he was counting on wasn't what he thought. Let me take you back. To understand how I ended up here, you need to know where I started. I wasn't always this jaded. A few years ago, I was happily married to my first husband, a quiet man who worked in construction. We weren't rich, but we were content, saving up for a house in the suburbs of Hanoi. Then one morning, I got the call that would change everything. He'd been in a car accident at work. He didn't make it. The grief was like a weight I couldn't shake, heavy and relentless. Between his life insurance and a severance package, I ended up with 500 million VND. It was more money than I had ever seen, but it felt like blood money. My in-laws, sweet people in their late 70s, told me to keep it. "We don't need it, Hoa," they said. "You're young. Use it to start over." I tried to share it with my brother-in-law and his wife, but they only took a small amount, insisting the rest was mine. And there I was, 39 years old, widowed, sitting on a small fortune. I kept working, throwing myself into sales meetings and client calls. But when I came home to my small apartment, the silence was deafening. I'd make coffee for 2 out of habit, then stare at the extra mug, feeling the ache in my chest. I wasn't poor, but I was broken. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could make the world feel less empty. That's when Tuan walked into my life. Tuan was a sales rep at a partner company, the kind of guy who could light up a room with a joke and a smile. He was 43, with a boyish charm that hid his rough edges. We'd crossed paths at work events, trading small talk about clients or the latest tech trends. One day, over coffee at a conference, I spilled it all. My husband's death, the loneliness, the way I felt like I was just going through the motions. Most people would have squirmed or changed the subject, but Tuan listened. He cracked a few light-hearted jokes. Nothing mean, just enough to make me laugh for the first time in months. "Your husband was lucky to have you," he said, his eyes soft. "I'm terrible at relationships, Hoa. I get dumped faster than a bad Tinder date." He laughed, but there was a hint of truth in it. We started meeting outside of work, grabbing drinks at a dive bar in the city, talking about everything from music to our childhoods. Tuan grew up in Hanoi, in the shadow of his father, a successful real estate developer who had made millions flipping properties across the city. Tuan's mom had left when he was young, chasing a lavish lifestyle his dad wouldn't fund. It left Tuan with a chip on his shoulder, always feeling like he had to prove himself, but never quite measuring up. I didn't see it then, but that insecurity drove a lot of what he did. One night, as we walked along the city's famous lake, he picked up a crumpled receipt I dropped and stuffed it into his already bulging wallet. "You're like a kid, Tuan," I teased, laughing as he fumbled with loose change. "Hey, I'm 43, thank you very much," he shot back, grinning. That moment, small as it was, made me feel alive again. The hole in my heart didn't seem so big anymore. A year later, when Tuan confessed he had feelings for me, I hesitated. My first husband's memories still lingered, but I felt like he was telling me to move forward. So I said yes to dating Tuan, ignoring the whispers from friends who thought it was too soon. Then, one evening over dinner at a barbecue joint, Tuan caught me off guard. "Hoa, we're not getting any younger. Why don't we just get married?" His eyes sparkled with that impulsive energy I'd come to love. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was serious. "Okay," I said, surprising myself. "Let's do it." It wasn't until after I said yes that Tuan dropped another bombshell. "Oh, by the way, I'm living with my dad," he said casually, like he was mentioning the weather. "He's been sick, needs some help. You cool with that?" I froze. He had mentioned his dad before, but not like this. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice tight. "Didn't want to scare you off," he said with a shrug. "It's no big deal. Meet him and you'll see." I wasn't thrilled, but I agreed to meet his father, hoping it wouldn't change things. Little did I know that meeting would shape everything that came next. The first time I walked into Tuan's dad's house in suburban Hanoi, it felt like stepping into a different world. The house wasn't flashy, but it screamed old money, the kind of quiet, understated wealth that carried weight without showing off. It was a 3-story house made of red brick, with a lawn shaded by towering oak trees. The air felt different there, heavier, almost as if the house itself had a story to tell. I tried to calm my nerves as I followed Tuan up the path. "Relax, Hoa," he said, flashing me that trademark grin of his. "Dad's going to love you." The door creaked open, and there he was, Tuan's father. He looked frail, sitting in a recliner propped up with pillows, his face kind but tired. He wasn't the vibrant, larger-than-life figure I had imagined from Tuan's stories. "Sorry to meet you like this," he said, his voice warm despite the strain. "I'm not as spry as I used to be." "No trouble at all," I said, forcing a smile. "It's great to meet you." We hit it off instantly. Tuan's dad asked about my work in tech, the challenges we were facing in a rapidly changing market. To my surprise, he wasn't just asking out of politeness, he seemed genuinely interested. We dove into a conversation about the latest trends in cloud computing, and for a moment, I forgot I was meeting my future father-in-law. It felt like I was talking to a mentor, someone who really understood the business. Tuan, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared into the house, apparently bored by the conversation, scrolling through his phone. "Dad's stingy," he muttered later as we left. "Could have built a mansion, but no, we're stuck in this place." I frowned. How could he call this beautiful house stingy? To me, it seemed like a home with history, full of character, but I let it slide. I was too caught up in the warmth of his dad's welcome. We got married a few months later, and to no surprise, we moved into Tuan's dad's house. It seemed like the logical thing to do. There was plenty of space, and his dad needed help. Tuan was full of ideas, and one day he turned to me, his eyes softer than usual. "I've been a lousy son," he confessed. "Dad's done so much for me, and I've done nothing." I was skeptical. Tuan wasn't exactly the most responsible person I knew, but I admired his heart. "You sure?" I asked. "You won't miss work?" He shook his head. "I'll regret it if I don't. I can always go back later." And so, we moved in. At first, it was great. I would come home after a long day, feeling drained from pitching software solutions to clients and find Tuan cooking dinner. Nothing fancy, just burgers or pasta, but it felt like a home. His dad would tell me stories about his days as a real estate developer, like the time he turned a rundown lot into a community center still standing in downtown Hanoi. His father wasn't just a businessman, he cared about people. He had funded local charities and mentored young entrepreneurs, and I came to admire him deeply. He would often pull me aside, offering advice and words of encouragement. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Hoa," he would say. "Don't let my son drag you down." But soon, things began to change. Tuan started slacking off. At first, it was small things. He would skip the dishes or leave the laundry undone. I tried to ignore it. At first, it was small things, a dish left in the sink here, a pile of laundry there. But soon, it became more obvious. I'd come home from work, exhausted after long hours of sales meetings, only to find Tuan sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Dinner's handled," he'd say, pointing to a takeout box on the counter. It wasn't the meal I was upset about, It was the fact that he wasn't contributing. The house had become my responsibility while he sat back and enjoyed the comfort his father had provided. One evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, feeling the weight of everything. The house felt heavier, colder. Tuan's dad had stopped making small talk with me at dinner. I could see the disappointment in his eyes when Tuan slacked off. It was like he was silently watching the son he'd raised squander the opportunities he had worked so hard to create. "Do you think he'll change?" I asked Tuan's dad one night after Tuan had left for the evening. His dad just sighed, his frail hands resting in his lap. "I thought marriage would straighten him out," he said, his voice soft but weary. "He's always been careless. I hoped he would see the value in hard work, but it's never stuck with him." I wanted to comfort him, but the truth was, I was beginning to question everything about my life with Tuan. The dream I had of building a family and a future seemed to be slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to hold on anymore. Tuan's behavior only got worse. One afternoon, I came home to find a shiny new vintage Mustang parked in the driveway. My heart sank. I didn't need to ask whose car it was. I already knew. "Whose car is that?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. Tuan didn't even look up from polishing a set of golf clubs he had left on the living room floor. "Mine," he said casually, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "You got your fancy bathroom from Dad. I deserve something too." I stared at him in disbelief. "What are you talking about? That bathroom wasn't my idea. It was your father's doing, because he wanted it fixed for his mobility, not because I asked for luxury." Tuan's response was flat. "Dad's loaded. He can afford it." "The Mustang? That was $30,000, my savings gone in one impulse purchase. I didn't even know how to process it. My savings that I had been carefully holding on to, the funds I had intended for our future, were slipping away just like that." Later that night, I checked my bank account. Nearly $50,000 had disappeared in just a month: car, golf clubs, designer clothes. I was furious, not just because he had spent my money, but because of how entitled he seemed. "You can't just take my money, Tuan," I shouted, throwing the bank statements on the table. "I work hard for this, and you're just treating it like your personal piggy bank." Tuan shrugged. "Dad's got millions. Once he's gone, we'll be set. What's the big deal?" I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. He was already counting down to his father's death as if it was some kind of prize waiting for him. I knew then that I couldn't stay. The man I married had become someone unrecognizable. That night, I took my bank card back from Tuan, locking him out of my accounts. His only reaction, a smirk. "Whatever," he said, as though he had nothing to lose. "You'll see, Hoa. I'm going to be set. Don't worry about me." But I wasn't worried about him. I was worried about myself. I had ignored the warning signs for so long, hoping things would change. But they never did. I started to look for ways out, for ways to start fresh, away from the toxic environment I had found myself in. The cracks in Tuan's behavior were becoming impossible to ignore. He had no respect for anything, not even his father's legacy. And yet, somehow, I still couldn't bring myself to leave right away. His father had always treated me with kindness, and I couldn't abandon him to this mess. He didn't deserve to be left with someone like Tuan. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult conversation with Tuan, I sat down with his father again. He could see the exhaustion in my eyes, the toll this life was taking on me. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Hoa," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I raised Tuan to be better than this, but I can't change him now. You deserve better." I smiled weakly. "Thank you," I whispered, though inside I was already preparing for the next step. It wasn't going to be easy. The path ahead was full of uncertainty, but one thing was certain: I couldn't continue living in this toxic, draining situation. Tuan's dad had always been a man of integrity, someone who put people over profit. I respected him for that, but I was beginning to realize that integrity was something I had to reclaim for myself. That day, when I walked out of the house and into my own space, it wasn't just a physical departure. It was a decision to take back my life, to stop allowing someone like Tuan to steal my peace. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. It took me a while to settle into my new routine. The house that once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary. I found myself waking up every morning with a sense of quiet determination. There were no arguments, no passive-aggressive remarks from Tuan, just peace, something I hadn't felt in so long. I focused on my work. I threw myself into sales meetings, closing deals with the same energy I had when I first started in tech. There was no more dragging myself through the motions, no more pretending everything was fine. I was reclaiming my identity, my space, and most importantly, my independence. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't escape the looming shadow of what had happened. Tuan's face still haunted me. The way he had manipulated me, treated me like an afterthought, and thought his father's wealth would somehow solve all his problems. He had taken so much from me, my money, my trust, and my belief in the man I had married. Yet, the more I distanced myself from Tuan, the more I realized how much I had allowed him to take. His greed, his selfishness, they had infiltrated everything in my life. And it wasn't just the money or the material things. It was the emotional toll, the constant nagging feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I decided to meet with Tuan's father again. After everything that had happened, I still felt a responsibility to him. He had been the one constant in my life, the one person who had never let me down. I made the drive to the house, my heart heavy but determined. I needed closure, not just for me, but for him. When I arrived, I was greeted by the same familiar warmth, the scent of cedarwood and old books filling the air. His father was sitting in his favorite chair, a slight smile on his face when he saw me. "Hoa, you're always welcome here," he said, his voice warm but frail. "I've been worried about you." I sat down across from him, my hands folded in my lap. "I've been doing better," I said, but there was a sadness in my voice that I couldn't quite hide. "I know," he replied gently, his gaze sharp despite his age. "I've been following the changes, but I need to ask you something, Hoa, something that has been weighing on my mind." I looked at him, confused. "What is it?" Tuan's father hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice filled with regret. "I've been going over my finances, my investments, my projects, and I've made some mistakes. Big ones. I don't know how much time I have left, but I wanted you to know I'm doing everything I can to make things right before it's too late." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He sighed deeply. "There's a lot I haven't told you, Hoa. My community center project, the one I spent so much money on, it failed. And the truth is, I took out a huge loan to fund it. I used everything I had as collateral, including the $500 million in savings I had been saving for my retirement. If I can't pay it back, it will all be gone." I stared at him, stunned. You've been using your savings as collateral for a loan?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, and if I don't make it, that money, it's gone. Tuan doesn't know. I didn't want him to worry, but now, I don't know what to do. I need to fix this before it's too late." The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. I thought back to everything Tuan had said, his belief that he would inherit millions from his father. He had been living in a fantasy, expecting everything to be handed to him on a silver platter. But the reality was far different. The $500 million Tuan had been counting on wasn't there. It had all been a lie. I felt my stomach churn. "I'll take care of it," I said, my voice steady. "You don't need to worry about anything. I'll help you figure it out." Tuan's father smiled weakly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're a good person, Hoa, you always were. Don't let my son drag you down any longer. He's not ready for this world, and I fear he never will be." As I sat there, listening to the man who had always treated me with kindness, I realized something important. Tuan's father had made mistakes, but he had never taken advantage of me like his son had. He wasn't perfect, but he was honest, and he cared about people, something I had come to realize was more valuable than any amount of money. The conversation turned to his health, and we discussed his end-of-life plans. It was a heavy topic, but I appreciated his openness. We spent hours going over his accounts, his properties, and his debts. I knew that once Tuan's father passed, I would be left to deal with everything. But I also knew that I couldn't let Tuan's selfishness ruin the memory of someone who had been so good to me. I left the house that day feeling a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had a plan, and I was going to make sure that Tuan's actions didn't define me or the legacy of his father. As I pulled into my new apartment that evening, I looked out over the city. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and I was ready for it. The days following my conversation with Tuan's father felt like a mix of clarity and uncertainty. I knew what I had to do, but the weight of what had just been revealed was heavy. The truth about Tuan's father's financial situation made me realize how much of his wealth had been an illusion in Tuan's eyes. The fantasy of a multimillion-dollar inheritance was shattered, and the reality was something much darker. But despite the unsettling knowledge that Tuan would eventually have to face the consequences of his actions, I felt a sense of relief. The burden of living in a lie, of constantly pretending everything was fine, had finally lifted. I was no longer trapped in the web of his selfishness, his greed, and his cold ambition. Tuan hadn't contacted me after our confrontation, and part of me was grateful for the silence. But another part of me knew that he would eventually come knocking, looking for a way to fix things, or perhaps to manipulate me into helping him. I wasn't sure which version of Tuan I would get, the charming, boyish man I had once loved, or the entitled, reckless person he had become. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let him drag me down again. One afternoon, I was sitting at a small cafe, sipping on a cup of coffee as I scrolled through some emails for work when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The message was short: "We need to talk, can you meet me?" It was from Tuan. For a moment, I felt a mix of anger and curiosity. What could he possibly want now? But I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. I had made the decision to move on, but I needed closure, and maybe this conversation would give me just that. I agreed to meet him at a park near his dad's house. The place felt neutral, no memories of our past life together, just a quiet spot where we could talk without distractions. When I arrived, Tuan was already there, standing near a bench, his back turned. He was dressed casually, but there was an air of tension about him that I couldn't ignore. As soon as he saw me, he turned and gave me a tight-lipped smile. But there was something in his eyes, a desperation, an uncertainty that I hadn't seen before. "Hoa," he began, his voice quieter than usual. I need to apologize for everything." I raised an eyebrow. Apology? This was the same man who had manipulated me, spent my money without a second thought, and treated his father's life like a game. I wasn't sure I could trust his words, but I decided to hear him out. "I've been an idiot," he continued, his tone softer. "I've messed everything up. You don't deserve what I did to you. I've been selfish. I thought the money would solve everything, and I was wrong. I was blind to how much I hurt you, and my dad." I crossed my arms, not convinced by his words. "You think saying sorry is going to fix everything, Tuan?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see how wrong I was." I stood there, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around us. The weight of his words hung in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another attempt to manipulate me, another round of him trying to make himself look like the victim. "You don't get to play the victim here," I said firmly. "You made your choices, Tuan. You spent my money, you lied, and you took advantage of my trust. And for what? A fantasy?" His face softened, and I could see a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I know, I messed up. I don't have anyone left now. My dad's gone, and I've pushed you away. I'm broke, Hoa. I have nothing." There was no triumph in his voice now, no arrogance, just a man who had lost everything. I could feel the anger in me soften, but it didn't change the fact that this was all on him. He had made these choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. "I'm sorry you're struggling, Tuan," I said, my voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I owe you anything. You made your bed, now you lie in it." Tuan looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't say anything for a long time, and I stood there, watching him. I could almost feel his world collapsing around him, like a man who had spent too long chasing after an illusion and was now forced to face the cold, harsh reality. "I know," he whispered after a while. "I just wanted to say goodbye, Hoa." I nodded, my heart heavy with everything we had gone through, everything that had fallen apart. "Goodbye, Tuan," I said softly. And with that, I turned and walked away. As I walked back to my car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The closure I had been seeking had finally come, not in the form of an apology I'd been hoping for, but in the quiet finality of saying goodbye. It wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of Tuan's inheritance, his father's will, and the mess of his finances. But I knew I could handle it. I was stronger now, more resilient. And I was no longer the woman who allowed herself to be manipulated by empty promises and false hope. I had my life back, and I was going to rebuild it piece by piece until it was something I could be proud of again. A few weeks passed, and I focused on rebuilding my life, one step at a time. The past seemed like a distant memory, something I had left behind in order to embrace the future. I started to find joy in the little things again: my morning coffee, quiet evenings spent reading, and long walks in the park where I could just be with my thoughts. At work, I was thriving. I had always been good at what I did, but now, with a renewed sense of independence and purpose, I felt unstoppable. I started taking on bigger projects, expanding my client base, and closing deals that brought in more revenue for the company. The confidence that had been stifled by years of manipulation and emotional neglect was slowly returning. But even as I moved forward, there were still lingering questions, unfinished chapters from the past that I knew I had to face. Tuan's father's death, the inheritance, and the mess Tuan had left behind were all things that I couldn't simply ignore. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my office, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and my stomach dropped. It was from Tuan's lawyer. My mind raced as I answered the call, unsure of what to expect. "Hello, Hoa," the lawyer's voice came through, calm but professional. "I'm calling regarding the settlement of Mr. Carter's estate. There are some details that need your attention." I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I had expected this call, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "Your father-in-law left you a portion of his estate. After reviewing the details, it seems there were some provisions in his will that concern you directly." I sat up straighter, my mind reeling. I had known that Tuan's father had been working on his finances before his passing, but I never imagined there would be anything tied to me in his will, not after everything that had happened. "What provisions?" I asked, my voice tight. The lawyer paused, then spoke. "Your father-in-law in his final years became concerned about his son's behavior. He made it clear that he wanted to ensure that his hard work, his investments, would be used wisely. As a result, he stipulated that the majority of his estate would go into a trust, but a portion has been left for you." I felt a mixture of disbelief and confusion. For me, what does that mean? "He wanted to ensure you were taken care of, Hoa. He knew you were the one who had been carrying the weight of the family, keeping everything together. He respected you more than he let on." The lawyer's words hit me harder than I expected. I had always known that Tuan's father was a good man, but I hadn't realized how deeply he had understood what I had gone through. I sat in silence for a moment, processing what he had said. "What do I need to do?" I finally asked. "We'll need you to come in and sign some paperwork to finalize the trust. The inheritance left to you is substantial, and it will be managed through the trust until you decide how to proceed with it." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Tuan's father had planned for this, had thought about me even after he was gone. He knew how much I had sacrificed for the family, and he wanted to make sure that I wasn't left empty-handed. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll come by to sign the paperwork as soon as possible." As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of closure. The final chapter in my story with Tuan was closing, and with it, the lingering doubts and fears I had about the future were starting to fade. The inheritance wasn't just about the money, it was a symbol of the respect and care that Tuan's father had for me. I knew that I would never be the same person I was before. The woman who had once been trapped in a toxic marriage, waiting for someone else to give her the answers, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned the hard way that life was about taking control of your own story, no matter the obstacles. The next day, I went to the lawyer's office, signed the necessary papers, and officially became the beneficiary of Tuan's father's trust. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I left the office, knowing that I had made the right decision for myself, that I had taken control of my own fate. As I walked through the streets of Hanoi, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened, the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the painful lessons that had led me to this point. But there was no bitterness in my heart. In fact, I felt a sense of peace. Tuan's chapter in my life was closed, and I was finally free. I found a new apartment in the city, one that felt like a reflection of the person I had become. I started redecorating, making it my own, a place where I could build new memories. The money from the trust wasn't going to change my life overnight, but it would give me the freedom to make choices on my own terms. I wasn't bound by Tuan's mistakes anymore. I was building something for myself, brick by brick. As I sat on my new balcony, overlooking the skyline of Hanoi, I realized that I had everything I needed to start over. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. I was more than the woman who had been manipulated, betrayed, and hurt. I was Hoa, a woman who had survived, thrived, and learned that the power to shape her life was in her hands. The next chapter of my story was about to begin, and I was ready for it.